Who would like to read? Who would like to read the first 40 verses of Deuteronomy 4? Okay, so everybody turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy 4. And Michelle has been kind enough to go ahead and read the first 40 verses. No, but if you want to read to 43, you can. Those are 41 to 43, a little extra, but oh, I always say Baal. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. The question I left with you guys last week was to look at the first 4 verses and verse 40 and to see if you could see a connection between the two of those two sections. So did anybody see a connection, or did you hear any connection when Michelle was reading? So what's a one word for God specified? What was that? Commands. Okay. Commands. We're going to use the word obedience because that is what he's wanting you to do. He's wanting people to obey, I think, and obedience as well. He is wanting the people to obey in the first 4 verses, and he comes back to that same theme, and he wants them to obey in the last verses here. So you want to remember, Moses has given all this background history about the nation, about where they've been and what they've come out of, and then he starts talking, and he's trying to draw some conclusions, and this opening challenge for the people is that they need to obey. And then he's going to end his sermon in verse 40 by saying, again, you need to be obedient. You need to have, you need to be obedient. In between verses 32, 39, and 5 through 8 also have a similar theme. And then 9 through 31, the largest section, is just about the second commandment, at least as we number them, which would be idolatry. So we'll talk about that most likely next week here. So let me start off asking a question. In verse 1, what words or concepts jump out to you here? Listen. Does anybody else have a different translation? So, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments. Hear, okay. Anybody else? Just listen and hear. As I said, say again. Hearken. Oh, yeah, that's a very old one. As I said before, in the Hebrew Bible, listen always has a connotation to obey. I was reading one author, and he was talking about that he let I think it was his son, go spend the night with the family, and then come back, and the child got in trouble because his mother said something, and his response was, I hear you. And the father interpreted that, rightly so, to mean, well, I hear what you're saying, Mom, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just acknowledging I hear it. And he's like, no, none of that. If your mother tells you to do something, you're going to do it here. And so your translations may say here, but at least as far as Moses was concerned, it always meant to listen, to obey. And that's what you need to do. Whenever it says, hear, O Israel, it means you need to obey what it is I'm going to say to you. Because God doesn't say things just to say things. He says things for us that he wants us to listen to and obey. So Moses wants everybody to hear what he's about to say through the inspiration of God, to obey them. Anything else jump out at you at verse 1? Live. So he says, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I'm teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go and take possession of the land. It's important for us as we're talking with people, as we're talking with our friends, our neighbors, our children, our spouses, anybody, that we understand that God's purpose in obedience is to bring life. He's not like you and I, to where sometimes our rules make sense, and sometimes they're capricious and arbitrary, and sometimes they're just wrong. God's purpose in giving laws and giving statutes and commandments was that people might live. So what does it mean to live? Try to give you guys open-ended, easy questions. Say that again?
Well, the generation before them died because they didn't obey.
Okay, so...
I mean, he was saying
Okay. Sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we so translate the blessings of God into a physicalness that we forget that God is more than that. And when he says so that you might live, it really isn't talking about that you're going to have a length of days. It really isn't talking about that you're going to be able to live 70, 80, 90, 100 plus years in this land. It really is trying to say that you're not going to die, you're going to be in harmony with me. So when you get to the end of Deuteronomy in chapter 30, you have that contrast between life and death. And as far as the Israelites were concerned, to live meant to be in harmony with God. Oh, very good. I was going to say that. You beat me to it here. It really is quality and not quantity of life. Yes, sir? Wow, it's like you guys are reading my notes. So that was John 10:10. I didn't even have a chance to ask that question. That is what Moses is talking about. And you want to get out of the mindset of thinking, well, this is the Old Testament. It has no value. It's just talking about the Jews, just talking about whatever. And realizing that this is all God's word, and he hasn't just brought something brand new into the church and taught new teachings that weren't ever taught before. There is this continuity of thought from Genesis all the way through the Revelation. And life, to live, is one of those thoughts. Moses wants the people to obey so they can live and then take possession of that land. And when they live, that means they're in harmony with God. Just like Jesus said, that you might have life and might have life more abundantly. He wants you to have more than just a quantity. He wants you to have this quality of life. And you should have recognized at least a few times in your lives that when you're living in harmony with God, everything just seems to be better. Not that you have less problems, not that you have less bills to pay, but at the end of the day, when you go to bed, you just feel better. You still have troubles.
Better outlook.
Yes, it is a better outlook because you just know God's going to take care of things, and no matter what happens, God and you are right, so you don't have to worry about things. When we're on our own and we're focusing on ourselves, then sin really starts to wear on you, and it starts to break you down, and then your life does take a decidedly downward turn. So Moses, he starts off telling the people, this is what I want. I want you guys to live. This is why I want you to obey the statutes and the judgments, that you may live, and I'm teaching you to perform. Does anybody else have a different translation? So in verse 1, now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and judgments which I'm teaching you to perform. The word perform, anybody else have something different besides perform? Do them, all right. Okay, we do want to understand that I don't, perform just always strikes me as odd, even though I'm doing it here. And that's what Moses wants you to really understand, that you need to be doing these commandments. It's not something that you listen to. It's something that you actively engage in, and you do these things. Either don't do these bad things, do these good things, change this attitude, do something. It requires effort and energy on our part, which is what Moses wants them to understand. Teach you to observe, all right? And what we follow. Yes, sir. Take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You should not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I have commanded you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord has done in the case of Baal Peor. For all the men who follow Baal Peor, the Lord your God has destroyed them from among you. But you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today, every one of you. What happened in Baal Peor? So when you have a question, you should always look at your Bible to see if you have any cross references. If you have any cross references, it should direct you to the right section of the Old Testament here. I have a good 30 minutes to wait for an answer, so I have nothing but time. Numbers 25. What happened in Numbers 25? Ah. Say it again? Oh, they were following the advice of Balaam? Is that what you said? What was his advice?
Well, they couldn't curse him, so he said, you've got to get him to, intermarry, supposedly take, mingle with them.
So Moses is reminding the people there that you remember when we got near the Promised Land again, and you guys started marrying the Moabites, giving your daughters in marriage to Moabites, and you guys were worshiping their gods. And obviously, God Almighty was not pleased with that, which is why he sent a plague. And then Moses called the Levites to him, take care of things. He told the leaders that they need to kill anybody who is engaging in this sin. And then, of course, one particular individual was outstanding. Anybody remember that person's name? Phineas, yes. Remember what he did? Yeah, so there was one of the gentlemen brought in a Moabite bride into the camp. And then, of course, they were in the tent, having sex. Phineas stabbed him. It does mention the name of the man who died as well as the woman who died. And she was a leader of the Moabites. So you want to understand, it wasn't per se sex that was the problem. Rather, it's what it represents, which is you yoking yourselves, you uniting yourselves to the Moabite gods. And I'm a jealous God, as we read here. I'm a consuming fire. And so you cannot have both. You either serve me or you're my enemy. And those are the only two options you have. And so Moses is telling the people, you remember what happened in Baal Peor. You saw it with your own eyes. And those of you that are alive today, why are you alive? Because you obeyed. Because you kept yourself to God. You won't get this from your translation. But verse 4, but you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today, every one of you. Some of your translations might talk about cling to God, because that's exactly what Moses writes back in Genesis, that a husband and wife, a man will separate and then cling to this woman and have a new family. This is the kind of relationship that God is trying to describe. This new relationship, you need to hold fast to God, cling to him, and because you do that, you're going to live. If you don't do that, you're going to die. Remember, Moses is standing on the plains of Moab. They can see the Promised Land over there, and he is talking and talking and talking. He has given them all the things they've done in the past, and he is trying to remind them of what they need to do in the future. Because he himself will say over and over again, I'm going to die here. I'm not going to make it over to the Promised Land. And the only way you guys are going to survive in the Promised Land is if you change what you've done in the past and be different than previous generations. And part of that is about obedience. You can't say you know God without obeying. You can't say I have a relationship with God when you choose to ignore his laws and statutes and rules and commands and all that stuff. To know God is to obey God. Does Jesus say anything like that? He does say something similar. If you love me, keep my commandments. All right. If we're going to say we have a relationship with God, then we need to keep his commandments. Now let's go to verse 40. So we looked at 1 through 4, and then verse 40 says, so you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I'm giving you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, that you may live long on the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. As you read the Old Testament, you're going to see this kind of structure time and time again, where you have, it goes one point, steps in, and then it steps back and steps back. And then these 2 points have some similarity. These 2 points have some similarity. And then oftentimes the center point is what is of emphasis to them. So for us today, we have all kinds of electronics. We have all kinds of fonts, all kinds of styles that we can use to emphasize things. But you can imagine millions of people listening to Moses talk, and they're not going to get a lot of those things. So people in ancient societies trained themselves to hear things and look for patterns. And one of those patterns is this right here. It's called a chiasm. C-H-I-A-S-M. It's from the Greek letter chi, and you can see we got an A prime. That's what it means there. So Moses starts off by saying you need to obey, and then he ends this sermon by saying you need to obey. He goes to the next step in verses 5 through 8. What's his emphasis? And 32 to 39. What's the emphasis? What is the connection between those two sets of passages? So take a moment to look at it. While you're looking at that, came across an interesting story. A grandfather is studying with his grandson. He's trying to teach him Micah 6:8. He says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God." As the grandson was getting the verse down pat, a thought struck him. "But Grandpa," he said, "I don't quite understand. It'd be hard to be humble, walking with God." What an outstanding concept of the greatness of God for a 7-year-old. Moses would have been pleased to have heard his people respond in such a way. He did not want them to be ungrateful for the continual blessings and faithfulness of God. For if Israel ever lost the spirit of gratitude to God or failed to pass it on succeeding generations, they would be spiritually, morally, and physically in trouble. I always thought that was a good story here. Any thoughts? Okay. Well, let me ask you, when you read verses 5 through 8, what are they talking about? Talking about the nations. Anybody else? No? Okay, so let me look at this here. So, we're getting closer. So, in verse 5, it says, "See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it." So Moses says, I've taught you guys these statutes, these commands. "So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom, your understanding on the side of the peoples who will hear all these statutes. Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as to the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law, which I'm setting before you today?" You know that aside from this place right here and Deuteronomy 25, Israel is never called a great nation. They worship a great God. The Ninevites, well, they're a great nation, but Israel's never called a great nation. They're always talked about exactly the opposite. As Moses will say later on, that God didn't pick you because you were more numerous or because you were more powerful or richer or wiser, anything like that. It was always about them being so small. But here in these few verses, 3 times, Moses says you're a great nation. And you want to see that what makes Israel great is what? More specifically, in the context of that, what makes them great is what the nations see. See. What do the nations see? I apologize. You guys are just frustrating me here. So let's look at this. Very good. So in verse 5, God's given them commands and statutes, and they're supposed to keep them in verse 6 and do them. When they keep them and do them, well, then the nations will see these things, will hear these things, and they will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. And then they have two rhetorical questions about what kind of nation is this that is able to do these things, that has these kind of laws. And Moses wants people to understand that Israel is unique. And they're unique because of the laws and commandments God has given them. Now, of course, the nations around them, they had laws and commandments. We do have quite a few archaeological artifacts that list off thousands of laws, rules, and commands. However, one of the things that really makes Israel unique is what we would term social justice. In their treatment of strangers, in their treatment of widows, of orphans, those who have no power in the society as a general rule. Which is why we'll read later on about when you're threshing, when you're harvesting your grain and stuff falls behind you, don't go back and pick it up. Leave it there because God enabled it to fall so that other people who don't have the resources you have can get those things here. Other nations had rules about marriage. Some had rules about divorce. Some had rules about killing, stealing, those sort of things here. But very few, if any of them, had any sort of rules about treating those who have no power. The Queen of Bathsheba, why do we know her?
She was impressed with Solomon's wisdom.
You're right. So Solomon was the wisest person, and that came out in his writings and his words and all kinds of things. And a queen from a faraway land heard about it and came to see him. In the ancient society, wisdom was very important. People looked for that, and they wanted to know that. And so Moses is trying to talk to them in verses 5 through 8 that Israel is unique, and they're unique because of God's laws. That's what makes them unique. Now, a corollary to this is that those laws were historically verifiable. They weren't unique because they had a God nobody had seen. They weren't unique because some God that nobody saw spoke to somebody in a dream. They were unique because this God that nobody had seen gave them laws that everybody could see. But of course, that's the rub. What was it that people needed to see? Oh, very good. The obedience. They needed to be able to see the obedience. Now, looking at that verse, so verse 6, they need to be able to see the obedience of that. If you were to apply that to us today, how might you do that? How might you do it for our church right now? You want me to use which instead of that? You said, how do we do that? Oh, okay. How do we do whatever verse 6 says? So you're going to want to look at verse 6 again. You're going to want to look at it. Say to yourself, okay, what's going on here? And what is it that we can do? Because God just didn't give this to the Israelites the one time and expect that was all of value it had. He has given it to us because it has eternal value to us. What is that value? Yes, sir.
Reading that here, I'm thinking about, Jesus says that you don't light a lantern or a candle and put a bucket or a basket over it. You let your light shine
Oh,
so that others can see that you are obedient to God.
very good. That's spot on. Oftentimes oh, yes, sir. Tom?
What we can do is to read and study what God says that we should be doing and do that instead of what we want to do.
That is true. What I want you guys to think about, and what you should make a note at that verse, is about missions, about evangelism. Oftentimes, we think about evangelism as being solely my ability to tell a person the plan of salvation and step it out and flip through the verses and answer the questions and take care of these objections and this long list of stuff, which usually intimidates a great many people. But this verse right here is saying one of the motivations for missions, one of the ways in which missions is successful, is not in your words, but in your obedience. When you're obedient to God's word, people see. And when they see, well, what do they say? What did verses 7 and 8 say? Let me see here. For what great nation is there that has a God so near it as is the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law, which I'm setting before you today? One of the reasons people become Christians, one of the reasons people want to have a relationship with God is not because you said the words, Jesus died for your sins, but because they see in your life that you are obedient to God, and then they see this peace, which Paul says surpasses understanding, and they want that. Like Dad was saying, you don't hide your light under a bucket. It needs to be seen for all the world. And in that context, light is talking about our obedience to God. Because you can't say you love God and, of course, hate your brother. If you love God, you need to love your brother. And when you love your brother, as 1 John says, you're loving God. So Moses here is trying to get the people to understand that if they can just obey, well, the nations around them will see this, and they will want to come to the truth about the one true God. Because at the end of the day, there is just one God, and he is the God of Gentiles and Jews. Now, Moses had said back in Exodus 19 that God wanted to make them a kingdom of priests. And the goal would have been, had they been faithful in that time and place, that they would have been people who would go to the nation, seated on their behalf, and started persuading people. But they didn't. They got caught up in the golden calf, and it all went downhill. But still, that idea of your actions being a light to the world is one that reverberates throughout the Old Testament. I want to say Isaiah. Let's look over at Isaiah. I want to say Isaiah 2. You know, Isaiah is talking about the future. And he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, the word which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many people, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears and pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. The nations were going to come to Jerusalem, come to Israel, to learn God's ways, because they had seen how God had treated Israel, and they had seen how Israel had been changed by following God. Now, for us today, it is that simple. If we choose to live a life of obedience to God, people are going to see that. And they're going to see it one of two ways. They're going to see it and hate us because we say by our life that this is wrong and we're not going to do it. Or they're going to see it and say, I want that. And they're going to choose to ask you questions. And then, of course, you'll have the opportunity to be humble because you'll realize that you don't remember all the passages you need to, but you don't need to remember all the passages because the power has always been in the Word, not us, not my words. Did you notice the parallelism between verses 7 and 8? So he says, for what great nation is there that has, and then in verse 8, for what great nation is there that has, and so he's saying the same thing, just in two different words. So in verse 7, has a God so near to it as the Lord our God whenever we call on him. And in verse 8, statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I'm setting before you today. So there is a sense in which people have God when they have the commands, which is why the Ten Commandments are put in the Ark of the Covenant and saying this is God's presence. This is God himself. Because if you are listening to God, obeying God, well, God is there. I remember being a new Christian, very new Christian, walking to church one day and I had a hoodie or maybe a stocking cap on, and some old lady said, you can't do that. Because I think I might have been called on to pray or something like that. And she's like, you can't do that. I'm like, oh, okay. So I took it off here, and she talked about some things here and talked about the Lord's Prayer. You know, kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven here. And when I was in that situation, I just thought all it meant was the church, because that's what she conveyed to me, that now you're part of the church, you can't do these things because this is how the church operates here. But Jesus' prayer is more than the church. He's trying to say wherever God's will is being done, that is where God is. And this is what Moses is trying to get across here, that there's a sense in which the commandments are synonymous with God, and if you have the commandments, you have God, and if you have God, you have the commandments. And because you have God or the commandments, which are one and the same, you're a great nation. And that's what makes you great, because you're being in obedience with God. Questions on those 3 verses? 4 verses? Okay, so if we go to verses 32 through 39, what are those about? Well, verses 5 through 8 are about what makes Israel great, what makes Israel special. But verses 32 to 39 are about the uniqueness of God. Very good. Is that you, Brandon? All right. The uniqueness of God. I want you to notice that we have rhetorical questions again, just like we had in the first section. We have a series of rhetorical questions. He says in verse 32, indeed ask now concerning the former days which were before you since the day that God created man on earth and inquired from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard it and survived? Or has a God tried to go a nation from another nation by, and I want you to count these, 7 things, by trials, by signs and wonders and war, by mighty hand and by an outstretched arm and by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes. To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God, there is no other beside him. So Moses starts off saying you need to be obedient And because you're obedient, this makes you guys unique. You're this great nation. And then he goes back, he's going to talk about the uniqueness of God, and then the final challenge about being obedient. The uniqueness of God. Everything he points here is something that, again, is verifiable. The people could look back and say, yeah, we talked with Moses, and he did say there was this burning bush. We were on that mountain, and we heard that voice. We saw the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke by day and night lead us through the wilderness. We saw manna come down. All these things that he talks about were things they could see and reference. One of the things I want you to realize from that is that Christianity, God's religion, is a historically verifiable religion. If you become a Buddhist, if you become a Hindu, it doesn't matter whether we could go back in time and prove that there were errors some places, that this never really happened, that Buddha really didn't get enlightenment under this tree, because that has no bearing on what they believe today. But Christianity is exactly the opposite. Everything has a bearing on whether Jesus lived, whether he taught as he taught, whether he hung on the cross, and whether he was raised on the third day. If those things are false, then as Paul says, we are to be of all men most pitied. But because they're not false, because there are things that people saw and heard and record, we can have this confidence. We need to be more confident about the historical veracity, the truthfulness of what we believe. It's not that we need to be able to prove every single point. It's not that we need to go through the Gospel of Luke and say, well, this is why you use this word here because of these things here. Because that's not the important thing. The important thing is about Jesus, and if enough time comes to pass, God shows all these things to be true. I don't know if you know this, but in the 1800s, there were a number of gentlemen who sought to disprove the Bible. They sought to disprove the Bible based on terminology in Luke, based on geography, based on words used. And you know what? They all flipped over and became Christians. Because when they went to investigate that, they're like, well, I'm going to go over to the Promised Land. I'm going to dig down. I'm going to see what happened. And everything comes up exactly the way God said. Now, it doesn't come up at the moment they said. It may take 100 years for them to discover the right piece of information, but it's never been disproven. When we lived in Utah, the Mormons loved to try to give historical background to their belief, but they had not 1 ounce of proof, not one shred of proof that anything they said in the Book of Mormon actually happened in America. Nothing lined up at all. But everything in the Old Testament is verifiable. And the uniqueness of God is that he has done things that can be seen, have been seen, and have been noted by all of people, which is what he was saying. So look at those rhetorical questions. In verse 34, or has a God tried to take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war, and by an outstretched hand, by an outstretched arm, by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Which is what we see when we get to the book of Joshua, that the people had heard about what God had done to Egypt. So the people knew what God was doing because he did things to be seen, to be heard, to be realized. So in verses 32 through 34, we see these are the reasons God is unique, because he's done these things. And I want you to see that it goes from creation all the way down to redemption. Starts off talking about God created man, down to God redeeming man. And the whole purpose of all this is what? The whole purpose for God doing these things, according to Moses, is what? You'll need to look at the passage. Look at the verses.
The question again is
The whole purpose for Moses writing things, the whole purpose for God doing these actions, taking these actions, according to Moses, is what? Well, while that is a true statement, that's not what Moses recorded. That is closer. Well, that's true too. Does anybody have verse 35 in their Bible? I didn't know if I was the only one that had my verse 35. Oh, so that is why God did what he had done. So they might know that the Lord, he is God, and there is no other beside him. God did all these things so they might know who God is. That was the reason he did these things, so people can have a relationship with God, understand who he is. He didn't do these things to destroy people, to punish people, to extract revenge or anything like that. Those are incidental. He did things to show the nation of Israel who is God and that he alone is God and there's no other God like him. As later on I'll talk about that he is God of God, Lord of lords. There is no one like him. He alone is God, which is what he wants. We'll have to stop there. And we have a few more things to say about uniqueness of God, and then we'll talk about the middle section, about the second commandment. If you have any particular question, anybody have any particular question? Well, it's still fresh in my memory. Okay, class.